Eagles Rest, Colorado Territory, 1884. The town of Eagles Rest sat cradled in a high mountain valley where the peaks stayed capped white clear into June. It was the kind of country that made a man stop what he was doing some mornings just to look at it. Rhys Bannon had never quite gotten used to how the light came down gold and slow over those ridgelines at the hour he usually rode past Verity Sinclair's small cottage on his way to town. She was at the washtub that morning, sleeves pushed up, dark curling hair coming loose from its pins, wringing someone else's linens with the kind of practiced efficiency that told a man plainly she'd been doing this work for longer than her circumstances should have required of her. Rhys reined in at the fence without entirely deciding to, doing most mornings for 3 weeks running now what he'd started calling, to himself, simple neighborliness. "Morning, Mrs. Sinclair," he said. Mr. Bannon. She didn't look up right away, focused on the twist of wet fabric in her hands. Though he'd learned enough of her rhythms by now to know the pause before she answered wasn't disinterest so much as caution, carefully practiced. "Fine morning for it," he said, nodding at the mountains behind her, gone violet and gold in the early light. "Fine morning for most things," Verity said, finally looking up, something almost like warmth breaking through the caution for just a moment before she caught it and pulled it back in. "Though I expect you didn't stop your horse at my fence 3 mornings this week to discuss the weather, Mr. Bannon." Rhys considered denying it, decided against the dishonesty. "No," he admitted, "didn't." Verity set down the wet linen, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at him directly, the caution in her face hardening into something more deliberate. "I'm a widow," she said, quiet but plain, the words carrying the weight of something she'd said many times before, to many men, as a door closed firmly rather than an invitation. "I don't imagine that's the kind of complication a man riding through Eagles Rest is looking to take on." Rhys held her gaze a long moment, the mountains behind her, catching the first full light of morning. "Well," he said finally, "then let me give you a new beginning instead. Seems a shame to let a woman with hands as capable as yours spend the rest of her days doing other people's washing, when there might be a better answer sitting right in front of her, if she was willing to look at it plainly." Neither of them could have known, standing at that fence in the gold morning light, that the answer to what had really happened to Edmund Sinclair 8 months earlier was about to become considerably more urgent than either of their hearts. Verity had married Edmund Sinclair 6 years earlier. He was a rancher's son, with land bordering the best water in 3 counties. In those early years, he had a reputation for exactly the kind of steady decency that made a young bride from a modest family in Denver believe she'd made a fortunate match indeed. The Sinclair Ranch had prospered under Edmund's management, expanding steadily across land that climbed toward the mountain foothills in long green pastures, fed by a stream that ran clear and cold even through the driest summers Colorado Territory offered. Verity had settled into ranch life with a competence that surprised even her own family, learning the rhythms of cattle and weather and mountain seasons, much as she'd once learned piano and needlework back in Denver. She believed, for most of those 6 years, that whatever hardships came with frontier life were more than balanced by a marriage built on genuine partnership. She'd learned to read the mountains themselves the way Edmund had taught her. Which cloud formations over the western peaks promised an afternoon storm? Which shade of blue haze on the far ridgeline meant a dry spell had settled in for weeks rather than days? Knowledge she still carried with her every morning, even now, long after the man who taught it to her was gone. Edmund had died 8 months before that morning at the washtub, found at the bottom of Cutter's Ravine, 3 miles from the ranch house, his neck broken in a fall the county coroner had ruled accidental. A spooked horse, a narrow trail, a man thrown in the worst possible place to be thrown. Eagles Rest had grieved him properly, the whole town turning out for a funeral that filled the small church past its capacity and had moved on, as towns do, within a season or 2. Grief settling gradually into ordinary memory for everyone except the person left holding the largest piece of it. Verity had not been permitted to move on quite so easily. Edmund's brother Silas had resented, for as long as anyone could remember, that their father had left Edmund the better half of the family land when the old man died young, leaving Silas, barely into his own adulthood at the time, to make do with rockier ground and a smaller share of water rights. He'd nursed that resentment for decades and had contested Verity's inheritance within a month of Edmund's funeral, producing an old, obscure territorial statute suggesting that ranch property acquired before a marriage, as the original Sinclair claim had been, reverted to blood family rather than a surviving spouse if no children existed to inherit it directly. The territorial court, unfamiliar with the statute and unwilling to rule quickly on unclear precedent, had frozen the estate pending review, leaving Verity with nothing but the small cottage on the property's edge and whatever income she could generate honestly. While the matter dragged through a legal process, nobody could tell her when might resolve. She had taken in laundry within 2 months of the funeral, her pride absorbing blow after blow as women she'd once hosted for tea now paid her modest coins to wash their linens, and had told herself, through gritted teeth and aching hands, that pride was a luxury she could no longer entirely afford. Rhys Bannon was 31, had drifted into Eagle's Rest 6 months earlier, with enough savings to lease a modest parcel at the valley's northern edge, and had built, in that short time, the beginnings of a small but honest cattle operation through the same patient, unhurried competence he brought to most things in his life. He'd left Kansas 3 years back, after a fiancée named Louise had died of a fever the winter before their wedding, a loss that had settled into him not as bitterness, but as a kind of quiet, permanent recalibration of what he understood mattered and what didn't. He'd spent those 3 years moving west in slow stages, working ranches in Nebraska and Wyoming, before something about the light in Colorado's high mountain valleys had convinced him, arriving in Eagle's Rest that spring, that he finally found ground worth settling on permanently. He remembered clearly the first morning he'd crested the pass into the valley itself. The whole basin spread below him, ringed by peaks still holding their winter snow well into May, and had felt, for the first time in 3 years of restless movement, something in his chest settle rather than simply endure. He'd noticed Verity Sinclair within his first month in town, the whole story of her circumstances delivered to him secondhand through the ordinary gossip channels of a small settlement. The dead husband, the contested inheritance, the proud woman reduced to laundering linens for families who'd once considered her their social equal. He'd felt, hearing it, an old and familiar ache reactivate somewhere in his chest, recognizing in her circumstance an echo of his own hard-won understanding that a life could be upended entirely by forces a person never saw coming and couldn't have prevented no matter how carefully they'd built things beforehand. He'd started riding past her cottage on his way into town, not by any particular plan, but by a route that simply seemed somehow to keep finding its way past her fence line, and had told himself, for the first 2 weeks, that his interest was simple neighborly concern for a woman clearly struggling. By the 3rd week, watching her work the washtub with that same tired, stubborn dignity, morning after morning, he'd stopped pretending the interest was quite so simple, though he'd said nothing of it yet, content for the time being to simply let his presence speak for itself in small, steady increments, rather than declarations she wasn't yet ready to hear. It was 3 weeks after that first real conversation at the fence, the mountain wildflowers coming up thick along the pasture edges, and the days stretching longer towards summer, that Verity mentioned something in passing that Rhys couldn't quite let go of afterward. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm by then, Rhys bringing small, practical offerings on his morning rides past, mended tech he'd noticed needed fixing, wildflowers when the season allowed, firewood split and stacked, though she'd never asked for it. Verity had commented dryly on that last habit just the week before, arms crossed, surveying the neatly stacked pile he'd left without a word. "I split my own wood perfectly well before you started riding past, Mr. Bannon," she'd said. "I'm not sure whether to be grateful or insulted." Wasn't questioning your capability, Rhys had said, caught slightly off guard by the directness of it. Just had extra time and an axe already in hand. Man splits wood for his own place, splitting a bit more costs him nothing but a few minutes. That's a generous accounting of your motives, Verity had said, though the corner of her mouth had betrayed something closer to amusement than offense. And Rhys had ridden on toward town that morning, considerably more pleased with himself than the exchange strictly warranted. Now, 3 weeks further along, Verity had gradually allowed herself the small luxury of actual conversation rather than careful deflection, though she still kept the deepest parts of herself guarded, with the practiced instinct of a woman who'd learned the hard way what trusting the wrong instinct could cost. Edmund's horse came home on its own, she said one morning, apropos of very little, watching the mountains rather than Rhys as she said it. The morning after he didn't come back from checking the north fence line. Old Ranger, calm as anything, grazing in the home pasture like nothing at all had happened. I've never quite made sense of that. A horse that's spooked badly enough to throw a rider at Cutter's Ravine doesn't usually walk itself calmly home 3 miles afterward, does it? Seems it would still be spooked, still be running somewhere, not standing peacefully in a pasture waiting for someone to notice it. Rhys turned that over carefully, the same careful attention he brought to reading weather or judging cattle. Man asked the sheriff about that? Everyone assumed it didn't matter, Verity said. Edmund was dead. The coroner ruled it an accident. Nobody in this town had much appetite for questioning a story that let them grieve simply and move on quickly. She finally looked at him. I didn't have the strength to question it either, if I'm honest. Not that first month. I was too busy simply surviving each day to interrogate the shape of my husband's death. And now? Rhys asked. Verity was quiet a long moment, the mountain wind moving through the pasture grass between them. Now I've had 8 months to survive, she said, and a horse that walked home too calm still doesn't sit right with me, whatever the coroner decided. Verity's brother-in-law found her at the cottage 2 days after that conversation. His visit announced by nothing but the sound of hooves in the yard and a familiar tightness that settled into Verity's shoulders whenever Silas Sinclair's name came up in conversation. Silas was 42 and had lived his whole adult life under the shadow of the smaller, rockier inheritance their father had left him when the old man died young. Back when Silas himself had barely finished growing into manhood, old enough to remember exactly which acreage had gone to his brother, never quite old enough to stop resenting it. He dismounted in Verity's yard with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being deferred to, and came directly to the point without much pretense of cordiality. Court's likely to rule within the month, Silas said. Territorial judge finally found precedent enough to settle it. I'd rather settle it between us directly, save us both the legal costs and the public spectacle of watching a widow lose her home in open court. What exactly are you proposing? Verity asked, her voice carefully neutral, despite the tension visible in how tightly she held her own hands. Sign the cottage and the remaining acreage over to me now, quietly, and I'll see you a fair settlement regardless of what the court eventually decides, Silas said. Call it a kindness between family, if you like. I'd rather not watch my brother's widow put out onto the road with nothing at all, whatever the law technically allows me to do. That's generous of you, Verity said, for a man who spent 8 months trying to take everything from me through a statute nobody in this territory had heard of until you found it convenient. Something flickered across Silas's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Land was always meant to stay with Sinclair blood, he said. Nothing personal in that, whatever grief it costs you. I'd simply rather resolve it plainly, before the court forces a resolution that satisfies nobody. He left without waiting for an answer, and Verity stood in her own yard a long while afterward, watching the dust of his departure settle, understanding with a clarity that frightened her exactly how much urgency had entered his voice. Urgency that didn't quite match a man simply waiting patiently for a legal process to run its natural course. Rhys found the ranch hand who discovered Edmund's body 2 valleys over. Tobias Reed had left Sinclair employment within a month of the funeral, and had clearly been carrying something uneasy in the 8 months since. "Wasn't my place to question the coroner," Tobias said, once Rhys had explained plainly why he was asking. The two of them standing in the shade of a line shack with the mountains rising sharp and clean behind them. "But I'll tell you what I told the sheriff back then, for whatever it's worth. Cinch strap on Edmund's saddle was cut clean through when I found him. Not frayed, not worn through, natural. Cut with a blade, the kind of cut a man makes on purpose. I mentioned it. Sheriff said saddle leather wears thin in odd ways sometimes. Ruled it consistent with an accidental fall regardless. You believed different," Rhys said. "I believed a fresh cut looks considerably different from worn leather. And I've mended enough tack in my life to know one from the other plainly," Tobias said. But Silas Sinclair was standing right there when the sheriff made his ruling, agreeing with every word of it. And I was a hired hand 3 weeks from losing my position, regardless of what I said. Wasn't in any position to argue with two men who both wanted the same simple answer. Rhys rode back toward Eagle's Rest with considerably more on his mind than he'd carried out that morning, the mountain light going gold and long across the valley as evening approached, knowing plainly that whatever he'd started asking about was no longer a curiosity he could simply set aside, once satisfied. This story's already found its way to places I never imagined when I sat down to write it. Brazil, Nigeria, India, the Philippines, corners of the world I'm only starting to learn the names of. If you're finding some quiet company in Verity and Rhys tonight, a like helps this kind of story reach the next person who needs it too. I'd love to know where you're listening from. I read every comment, and it still surprises me how far these evenings travel. Now, a cut cinch strap changes everything Rhys thought he knew about Edmund Sinclair's death. And he's about to bring that truth to a woman who spent 8 months trying simply to survive her grief, not reopen it. Rhys told her that same evening, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table in the cottage, the mountain sunset filling the window behind her with color neither of them paid much attention to. The last light catching the dust motes drifting slow through the small room. "A cut strap," Verity repeated, her voice gone very quiet. "You're telling me someone cut Edmund's saddle deliberately, that he didn't fall, that he was—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, her hands pressed flat against the table, as though steadying herself against something physical. "I'm telling you what a hired hand saw and was too frightened to insist on 8 months ago," Rhys said carefully. "I'm not telling you I know for certain what it means yet, or who did it, or why. I'm telling you because you asked the same question yourself about that horse walking home too calm, and I think you deserve to know you weren't imagining a reason to doubt the story everyone else accepted easily." Verity sat with that a long moment, the last of the sunset color fading from the window behind her, the room settling into that deep blue dimness that came just before full dark in the mountains, when the sky still held light, but the valley floor had already surrendered to shadow. "Silas came to see me 2 days ago," she said finally, "wanting me to sign over the cottage and land quietly before the court ruling. Said it kindly, dressed it up as generosity toward his brother's widow. But there was something underneath it, some urgency that didn't match a man simply waiting on a legal process. You think he's connected to this?" Rhys said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't want to think it," Verity said. "He's Edmund's brother. Whatever resentment sacked between them, that's still." She pressed her fingers briefly against her closed eyes. "I spent 8 months building a life around the idea that Edmund's death was simply a terrible accident, a piece of bad luck no one could have prevented. If it wasn't that, if someone did this on purpose, someone in his own family—" "You don't have to decide what it means tonight," Rhys said, "but I don't think you can unknow it either, now that you do." She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened into something more curious than afraid. "You never talk about your own losses," she said. "I know you lost someone too, back in Kansas. You've never once said her name to me directly." Rhys turned his coffee cup slowly. "Louise," he said. Fever took her the winter before we were meant to marry. I've never much talked about her, because most conversations about grief feel like asking someone to carry a weight that isn't theirs to hold. But I'll tell you, if you want to hear it. She used to say I never met a fence post I didn't want to straighten, even the ones standing perfectly fine. Called it my one genuinely useless habit. He allowed himself the smallest smile. I've noticed you've got a similar opinion of my woodpile. I do, Verity said, something gentler than caution finally settling across her features. Thank you for telling me about Louise. Seemed only fair, Rhys said, given how much of yourself you've had to hand over to me this evening. They sat together in the gathering dark a while longer, neither of them reaching for a lamp, the mountains outside the window fading from purple to black as the last light finally left the sky entirely. And Verity found some measure of comfort simply in not having to sit with the weight of it alone. It was 2 days later, the investigation still unresolved and hanging heavy over both of them, that Rhys arrived at the cottage not with news of any kind, but simply with a fish he'd caught that morning in the creek, running through his own leased parcel, offering it with the plain hope that one ordinary evening might do them both some good. Didn't come with anything to report, he said, holding it up somewhat sheepishly. Just thought a body's got to eat, regardless of what's hanging over her, and I make a passable trout when the mood strikes. Verity looked at the fish, then at him, and something in her chest loosened for the first time in days. That may be the most welcome thing you've brought me yet, she said, wildflowers and firewood included. They cooked it together on her small stove, working around each other in the narrow kitchen with an ease that surprised them both. Rhys teaching her, without quite meaning to turn it into a lesson, the particular trick his own mother had used for crisping trout skin properly. Verity laughing, genuinely laughing, for what felt like the first time in 8 months, when he singed his own sleeve, reaching too close to the flame. Some fence post straightening rancher you are, she said, fanning smoke away from his arm. Can't even fry a fish without setting yourself on fire. In my defense, Rhys said, entirely unbothered. The fish came out perfectly. They ate on the porch as the light went long and gold across the valley, talking of nothing consequential at all. A calf Rhys had lost patience naming, a piano piece Verity hadn't played in years but still remembered every note of, the particular way the mountains changed color depending on the hour. And Verity found herself watching him in the last of that evening light, thinking less about cut straps and contested inheritances than she had in a week, simply grateful for one ordinary supper that belonged to nothing but the two of them. They rode out to Cutter's Ravine together a few days later, Verity insisting on seeing the place herself for the first time since the funeral. The mountain trail climbing steadily through stands of aspen, already going gold at their edges, with the early turn of autumn approaching. The air thin and clean at that elevation, in a way that seemed to sharpen every color around them. The deep green of the pines, the white glare of snow still clinging to the highest peaks, even in late summer. The impossible blue of a sky, unclouded by anything but a few high, thin streaks of cloud. The ravine itself was a genuinely beautiful place, which struck Verity as its own particular cruelty. A narrow granite gorge, or a mountain stream cut down through rock, worn smooth over centuries, wildflowers still clinging to wet soil the cliff edges offered, columbine and mountain aster scattered purple and white against the gray stone. The kind of view that drew painters and photographers from as far as Denver some seasons, entirely indifferent to the fact that it had also, 8 months earlier, been the last thing her husband ever saw. The stream far below caught the afternoon light in bright scattered flashes, and somewhere overhead, a hawk rode the thermals rising off the sun-warmed rock, circling without effort. The whole scene composed with a beauty that felt, to Verity standing at its edge, almost unbearably indifferent to the grief it had witnessed. He rode this trail 100 times, Verity said, standing at the edge where the drop began, the valley spread out below them in every direction, peaks catching the afternoon light. Knew every turn of it since he was a boy. I've never quite believed a horse could spook badly enough here, on ground this familiar, to actually throw him. Rhys stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, his eyes moving over the terrain with the practiced attention of a man reading ground for information, rather than simply admiring scenery. "Trail's wide enough here, and the footing solid," he said, studying the path beneath them. "Man would need a considerably worse spot than this to actually get thrown, unless something else was working against him besides a spooked animal. Strike's a thing a person can borrow some days," he added, turning back to her. "Doesn't have to be entirely your own supply every single time. I've got plenty to spare, if you're willing to lean on some of it while we work out what actually happened here." Verity looked at him a long moment, the mountain wind moving her loose curls, and felt something in her chest shift. Not quite hope yet, still too fragile and uncertain for that word, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been dormant a long while, and was only now, cautiously, beginning to stir again. "I don't know how to thank you for taking this seriously," she said. Most men would have let a widow's questions about a cut strap go unanswered, rather than risk the trouble of actually asking them. "Wasn't much of a choice once I heard it plainly," Rhys said. "Man doesn't get to call himself decent while walking past an injustice he's capable of investigating." They brought Tobias Reed's account to the county sheriff together the following week, along with Rhys's own methodical notes, comparing the cut strap's description to ordinary wear patterns he'd studied on a dozen saddles since first hearing the story, and watched Sheriff Callum Wade's expression shift from polite skepticism to genuine unease as the pieces assembled themselves in front of him. "I ruled that an accident 8 months ago," Wade admitted, "on evidence that seemed sufficient at the time, and on the word of a family member standing right there, agreeing with the ruling. I'll admit that's not the same as investigating it properly myself." He looked at Verity directly. "I owe you a more thorough look than I gave this the first time, Mrs. Sinclair. That much is plain now." Silas was summoned to the sheriff's office 2 days later, and Rhys watched the man's composure crack in small, telling increments as Wade laid out what Tobias Reed had witnessed and never been properly asked to explain. "I don't know anything about a cut strap," Silas said, though his voice carried a tightness that hadn't been there discussing the matter with Verity in her own yard. "Boy's mistaken, or lying, or simply looking to cause trouble for a family that let him go without much ceremony. Man cut ties with your operation the same week your brother died," Wade said. "Wasn't let go for cause, according to your own foreman's records. Left on his own account, and hasn't worked Sinclair land since. Seems an odd coincidence for a man supposedly lying for no reason." "Coincidence is all it is," Silas said, though the color had gone from his face entirely. "There's also the matter," Wade continued, "of a survey request filed with the Territorial Land Office 3 months before your brother's death, requesting mineral assessment on the exact section of Sinclair land bordering Cutter's Ravine. Filed under your name, Silas, not Edmund's. Care to explain what you are assessing on land you didn't yet legally control?" The truth, once Sheriff Wade pulled the full thread of it, unspooled with the raw ugliness of a betrayal 8 months in careful hiding. Silas had learned, through a prospector passing through Eagle's Rest the previous year, that the section of Sinclair land bordering Cutter's Ravine likely sat atop a substantial silver vein. The same kind of discovery that had made fortunes overnight in half the mining camps scattered across Colorado Territory's mountains. He'd filed the survey request quietly, using his own name rather than risk alerting Edmund to a discovery that would have made his brother's already prosperous ranch worth a fortune neither of them had previously imagined, and had spent months afterward searching for some legal mechanism to claim the land for himself before Edmund ever learned what sat beneath his own pastures. The obscure inheritance statute had been his backup plan, discovered during that same search, intended to be deployed only if Edmund somehow learned of the silver discovery, and needed to be maneuvered out of clear ownership through legal means instead. But legal means took time Silas hadn't been confident he had. Not once he'd learned a second prospecting party was making inquiries about the same section of mountain land. And 8 months ago, faced with the genuine possibility of losing the silver claim to an outside party entirely, he'd made a choice he could never entirely take back. "Wasn't meant to kill him," Silas said, finally, in the small county jail cell where Sheriff Wade had him held pending formal charges. Verity and Rhys standing witness to a confession neither of them had fully expected to hear delivered so plainly once the weight of discovery finally broke him. Cut the strap thin enough that it should have simply failed gradually, thrown him somewhere safe, given me time to argue the land dispute while he recovered from a bad fall. Didn't account for which section of trail he'd be riding when it finally gave, or how steep the drop was at that particular bend. Told myself after that it was an accident regardless, that I hadn't meant for the ravine specifically, just meant to slow him down. "You still cut the strap," Wade said flatly. "Whatever you meant by it, you still made the choice that killed him." Silas said nothing further, and Verity, standing in the doorway of that jail, with 8 months of grief and doubt and cautious hope all colliding at once, found herself feeling something she hadn't expected to feel at the end of this. Not triumph, not even quite relief, but a kind of exhausted, sorrowful clarity, the truth finally settling into a shape she could actually grieve properly now, instead of simply surviving. She wept properly for the first time in 8 months that evening, sitting on the cottage porch, with the mountains going dark and star-scattered above the valley, Rhys beside her saying nothing at all, simply present, the same steady way he'd offered her from that very first morning at the washtub. "I couldn't grieve him honestly before," she said, once the worst of it had passed. "Not really. I was so busy simply surviving. The laundry, the legal fight, Silas's constant pressure, that I never let myself actually sit with the loss of him, the real Edmund, not the mystery of his death. The man who taught me to read weather off these mountains, who never once made me feel foolish for not knowing ranch work when we married, who used to hum off-key doing chores because he thought nobody could hear him." "Grief needs room to actually happen," Rhys said. "Hard to give it that room when you're fighting a legal battle and a murderer's brother-in-law all at once. Same time you're supposed to be mourning honestly." "I have room now," Verity said. Strange as it sounds to say that after a day like today. The truth is terrible, but it's mine now, properly, instead of a doubt I was too afraid to examine. She looked at him in the starlight. "You gave me that. The room to actually ask the question, instead of simply surviving the not knowing. Didn't give you anything you didn't already have the courage to start asking yourself," Rhys said. "Just helped carry some of the weight of asking it out loud." The territorial court resolved Verity's inheritance within a month of Silas's confession, the obscure statute he'd weaponized against her rendered entirely irrelevant by his own criminal conviction. The Sinclair ranch and its considerable new mineral value settling fully and legally into Verity's name, without further contest from any surviving family member. She found herself, that autumn, the owner of a ranch worth more than she'd ever imagined during those 6 years of marriage to Edmund. The silver claim alone, promising a fortune that would have seemed like fantasy to the woman who'd been laundering other families' linen just months before. She discovered, working through the practical business of managing that sudden wealth with a mining company's careful lawyers, that she had a genuine talent for exactly the kind of negotiation her old piano and needlework Denver upbringing had never prepared her for. Insisting on fair labor terms and safety provisions for any miners eventually working the claim. Terms the company's representatives found themselves agreeing to more readily than they'd expected. Rhys watched her navigate that transformation with the same quiet attention he'd brought to watching her at the washtub months before, and found himself, more than once, having to examine his own feelings honestly regarding a woman who'd gone, within a single season, from a struggling widow he'd felt protective toward, into one of the wealthiest landowners in the county. He rode past her fence 3 mornings that first week of the ruling, without stopping at all, turning the matter over privately, half convinced that whatever he felt for her now would look, from the outside, exactly like a poor rancher chasing a fortune he'd had no claim to when he'd first started splitting her firewood. "You've gone quiet on me," Verity observed one evening, finally catching him at the fence again, the two of them walking the pasture line at sunset, the mountains catching their last full color of the day. "Since the ruling came through, I'd like to know why, if you're willing to say it plainly." "Nearly didn't come by at all this week," Rhys admitted. "Kept thinking about how it would look, courting a woman with a silver fortune when I've got a leased parcel and a herd small enough to count twice before breakfast. Didn't want to be the kind of man who only finds his nerves once there's something worth finding it for." "You found your nerve 8 months before anyone knew there was silver under this ground," Verity said. "I watched you find it, morning after morning, at a washtub that had nothing to offer you but a woman's tired hands and a lost cause of a legal fight. I don't think a fortune erases that, Rhys. If anything, it simply means I finally have the freedom to choose you without survival forcing my hand at all. And I'd rather you trusted that freedom than doubted it into silence." He asked her properly a week later, at the very fence line where he'd first stopped his horse 3 mornings running. The mountain wildflowers he'd once brought her, now grown thick and wild along the pasture edge on their own accord. "I never did give you that new beginning I promised you at the washtub," he said. "Not properly. Circumstances got considerably more complicated than either of us expected that morning." "You gave me considerably more than a new beginning," Verity said. "You gave me the truth about my husband's death and the courage to actually grieve him, and 8 months of steady, patient decency I'd stopped believing men were capable of offering without expecting something in return." "Then let me finish what I started that first morning," Rhys said, and knelt beside the fence where their whole story had first taken root, the mountains rising gold and vast behind him. "Marry me, Verity Sinclair, not because either of us needs rescuing anymore. You've got land and fortune enough now to need rescuing from nothing at all. Because I've spent 8 months falling in love with a woman capable of surviving betrayal, grief, and injustice with her dignity fully intact. And I don't much want to spend whatever years I've got left finding out what it would have felt like to keep riding past that fence instead of finally asking properly." Verity knelt down in the wildflowers beside him, taking his weathered hands in both of hers. "Yes," she said, simply and completely. "1,000 times yes, Rhys Bannon. Though I'd ask you one thing in return, that we build whatever comes next on this ranch together, as true partners, the same way I once built a life with Edmund before everything went wrong. I don't want to simply inherit a new beginning. I want to build one properly, with someone who chose me before he had any reason to expect a fortune waiting at the end of it." They married that winter, in the same small church that had once filled to capacity for Edmund Sinclair's funeral. The whole town turning out again, though for an entirely different reason this time. The mountain peaks visible through the church's tall windows, dressed in their full winter white. Snow falling soft and steady outside as the ceremony proceeded. The whole valley hushed and gleaming under a fresh covering that made even the most familiar landmarks look newly made. Verity used a portion of the silver claim's early proceeds to fund a proper investigation and prosecution fund for the territory's court system, ensuring no future widow would face the kind of dismissive, incomplete investigation that had nearly let Silas Sinclair's crime stand forever as a tragic accident. Sheriff Wade, humbled by how close he'd come to closing the case wrongly, became one of the fund's strongest advocates, traveling to territorial capital hearings himself to argue for better standards of investigation in remote mountain counties. Tobias Reed returned to steady work on the Sinclair Ranch, this time as a foreman Verity trusted completely, and married a school teacher from the next valley over within 2 years. He liked to tell people, at gatherings afterward, that he'd finally found an employer who didn't question a man for noticing a worn cinch strap, a joke that had taken him the better part of a year to be able to tell without his voice catching partway through it. Rhys sold his own modest leased parcel and folded his cattle operation into the larger Sinclair ranch, the two of them building, across the following years, an operation that balanced the Silver Claim's sudden wealth with the same steady, honest ranching values Verity had first learned during her marriage to Edmund. They expanded the herd carefully, reinvested the mine's proceeds into water rights and grazing land rather than luxury, and became known across the county for paying fair wages to every hand who worked Sinclair land, miners and cowhands alike. She kept, in a small box on her writing desk, the original torn scrap of cinch leather Tobias Reed had preserved all those months. Not as a trophy of vengeance, but as a reminder, she told her own children years later, that the truth was always worth pursuing, even when the comfortable lie would have been considerably easier to simply accept and live with. The mountains stood the same as they always had above Eagle's Rest, indifferent and magnificent, regardless of whatever grief or joy played out in their shadow. And Verity found, in the years that followed, that she'd finally learned to love the view from Cutter's Ravine again. Not despite what had happened there, but because she'd finally earned the right to know the whole truth of it, and to build something genuinely new in its aftermath. She and Rhys rode out there together every autumn after that, when the aspens turned gold along the trail, not to mourn but simply to remember, the ritual becoming over the years its own quiet kind of tribute to everything the mountain had witnessed and everything it had eventually, finally, allowed her to heal from. There's a rare kind of courage in asking a question you're afraid of the answer to, and I think that's the real heart of this story, underneath the mystery and the mountains and the silver that changed everything for Verity Sinclair. She could have let the horse that walked home too calm remain an unexamined doubt for the rest of her life. Most people, I suspect, would have. It's easier most days to accept the comfortable version of a painful story than to risk discovering the comfortable version was a lie all along. It took a patient stranger riding past her fence and 8 months of hard-won trust before she found the courage to actually ask the question out loud instead of simply carrying the doubt silently. Rhys never once tried to solve her grief for her or rescue her from a fortune she didn't yet know was coming. He simply offered her steady company while she found her own way to the truth, and then stood beside her while she grieved it properly. And then, only once all of that was finished, asked her plainly whether she wanted to build something new alongside him. Even then, once the fortune complicated things in a direction neither of them expected, he had to find his own nerve all over again. Proof, maybe, that patience isn't a single act a person performs once and finishes, but something they keep choosing, morning after morning, fence line after fence line. Thank you for spending this evening with us in the mountains above Eagle's Rest. Until the next story finds you, keep riding.